Navigator. Part 1. Chains in the Void. Have you ever seen a jump? A rift in space-time is not a pretty thing. It looks like a curtain rent with an old blade. Fragments drift around the edges, for a dull knife tears rather than cuts. Its center is obsidian, devouring all light like gazing past the event horizon of a black hole. The mind doesn't know how to react to a complete lack of visual input and insists something is wrong. It tries to correct your eyes, throwing up dark purple and strange flashes of lightning. Don't look too hard. It's safer to stare unblinking into a star. The destroyer materializes, section by section, like it's being rendered by a computer grinding through a stress test. Completed sections of hull steam slightly, or maybe it's smoke. Tendrils of purple reach like groping fingers, curling around the engines and snagging mass driver barrels like the gas inside a plasma globe. The rift begins to collapse in on itself, but tendrils still reach for the ship, as if hyperspace is unwilling to give up that which once traveled the higher planes. Then, suddenly, as a surgeon stitches a wound, the tear in reality closes, and the grasping tendrils dissipate into nothingness. I can picture the destroyer looming in the void, crouched like a hunting predator. Almost imperceptibly, a single barrel from the gunhouses pitches upward a fraction of a degree. Then a flash lights the void, instantaneously countered by stabilization thrusters. This memory is seared into my retinas, as is the afterimage of the distant flare as 1,500 kilograms of Terran-manufactured, armor-piercing, depleted uranium slug meets the hull of a Shriek cruiser at 2,300 meters per second. 1/2 the mass times velocity squared. Energy cannons just don't do it like a railgun. I am Charlotte. It is not the name that was given to me, but the one I earned, and the one I use. I was born on the largest moon of the Varian cluster. Their garden worlds. High oxygen and low gravity. Few predators through their evolutionary history. Fewer natural resources. Unfortunate position on the outskirts of a distant system. Subsistence farming and small game hunting mostly. My species' first contact war wasn't even a war. Just a slaving crew that rounded up a couple hundred Vari for manual labor on another world halfway across the void. It's been a very long time since then. The Corps passed some regulations and a bunch of laws against slavery, set up some starports on the surface and a freight harbor in geostationary orbit. The cluster has assimilated. We're part of the greater collective now. Same rights as every other species throughout the galaxies. Bunch of the ultra-wealthy even set up their vacation resorts here. Except that this far out from the core worlds, none of those laws and regulations and tech mean much. 10 generations and FTL capabilities later, and the only real change is that when my father sold me and my sisters into the hold of the cargo hauler, the manifest had to say we each got 24 credits per shift. I didn't get to see my first jump, huddled in the lightless hold, breathing the stale atmo. The passage through the relay station was just a violent shudder of the hauler's frame and a numbness of my extremities that lasted scarce 20 breaths. Except that shudder was the cargo ship entering an FTL lane from a jump point 400,000 kilometers from the surface of my homeworld, and the numbness was my molecular structure exiting that same lane hundreds of light years away. The distances were incomprehensible. Still are. I'm just more used to hearing numbers like that now. That night was the first time I finally understood why creatures say the void is cold. It's not the temperature. I was overheated, crowded in that hold with the 100 or so others. It's being alone, and the sheer incomprehensible distances involved. The distance light travels in a year. Sure, the definition of a year varies depending on the world you're on. Not that it really matters. Light is fast. You're just alone out there. When that hold was finally opened, the light of the unfamiliar star was blinding. I couldn't believe I'd spent the first part of my life looking at the sky with yearning, because I got to see that sky now, filtered through a haze of radiation, shielding, and synthoglass reflections, and it brought nothing but fear. The Shriek Bulls herded us out of the hold with roars and shoves. My sisters were dragged one way and I another. They fought, I didn't. What could I do? Shrike are a combat species. They're naturally armed and armored, have a variety of senses beyond the standard, and uncommon shock resistance. Their civilization is known throughout the galaxies as a formidable military threat, and their mercs are quickly snapped up by private contractors or wealthy individuals in need of bodyguards. They have a reputation backed by results. They're the reason creatures get jittery when they hear high-grav predator. I didn't know what happened to my sisters. Someone told me they ended up on a shuttle toward Calestis Hub. If that's true, I knew they'd probably live out their days as companions in the entertainment district. I was shoved toward the mining crews. The only difference was the quotas, just a tick mark on a data pad and a careless number tattooed on my arm over some harsh sterilizer, not even worth a tracking chip. Once all the Veri were processed, the slavers herded us back to the cargo bays. There were more of us then. Species I recognized and species I didn't. Most I didn't. The backwater world I was born on didn't see many tourists. All my knowledge of the greater galaxies had been collected overhearing freighter crews loading their shipments of pelts off my homeworld. I remember the smell more than anything. Whatever the freighter had transported before us had left a stench that turned the atmo to soup, with ventilation filters that probably hadn't been changed in the lifetime of the ship. I lingered there, panting in the filth and humidity, packed with enough other creatures that I was forced to sleep standing. There was no way to track time in the darkness and fetor, but I did know that there was no juddering of the hull that marked the passage through a relay station. Sublight speeds, keeping us outside of the hyperlanes to ensure we stayed remote from anyone curious enough to examine a cattle freighter. Then we began to accelerate. The rumble of the drive engines under my feet vibrated the teeth in my jaw, bones compressed, tendons strained, and I would have crumpled to the deck if the press of bodies had not held me standing. Moans echoed through the hold as lungs were crushed and circulatory systems labored to keep brains conscious. It was a nightmare beyond anything I had imagined, a nightmare that lasted a lifetime. And when the nightmare ended, only a few moments of relief before deceleration, just as harsh to the mass of soft, garden-world species. I endured it better than most. I mentioned that I had spent my childhood gazing at the stars. When I was very young, one of the freighter captains told me that Veri made good void travelers. He didn't give me any reasons why. Probably just being friendly to some wide-eyed child that came to look at his ship. But I thought perhaps that this was one of them, until I lost consciousness and woke gasping. I'd have traded never seeing the stars again to be back on my homeworld with my sisters, toiling the earth to have enough food for the winter, and watching distant freighters jump through the relay station through the cracked lens of a scrounged telescope. Back before I knew who my father really was. But no creature gets to choose, I suppose, just react. When the hydraulic ramps opened, grinding on ancient hinges, we spilled from the hold onto the deck, dragging in lungfuls of filtered atmo and scrounging across the steel for the rations our captors had thrown at us. The Varian behind me fell when I moved. He'd died during the journey, and I hadn't known. He told me his name, I'm sure, but I can't remember it. The shriek waded through us, their hulking forms half as tall again as I am. One was coming toward me, talons pushed out and horns lowered. A creature of a species I didn't know froze in place, spines along its head and backbone limp with fear. Legs with backwards knees shaking. The Shrike didn't pause, just locked his talons out and drove them up, under the creature's ribs. It died, choking with punctured lungs. We all shrunk back as the slaver laughed and shouted something in a language I didn't understand. The moon was remote, a long, slow orbit that lengthened the years into lifetimes, a distant star that prolonged a permanent twilight on the tidal-locked surface, the stars nothing but faded blurs through the shimmer of radiation shielding. On the surface, the rock and ice were burrowed with mine shafts, dug and drilled and detonated into the surface to draw forth the trace metals contained within the core, inhabited by slaves that were husks of their former selves, starved, beaten, and exhausted by slavers who knew that on the edge of the black, it was cheaper to just find another remote settlement where no reports of missing creatures would make it to someone who cared, or could do anything about it. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I went down those mine shafts, I would not return. My species did not have the hardiness. Fleeing across a surface that lacked atmo was a joke. Fighting back against an elite combat species was a funnier one. My opportunity came during the entry shot injections, cocktails of antibiotics, antivirals, and vaccines to prevent the spread of diseases between worlds. I could see the front of the lines where they were separating the creatures into their new professions. Heavily muscled Guijek and multi-limbed Klissa, species far more suited to labor than my form, fragile in comparison. "I'm a pilot!" I forced the common through my burned throat and cracked lips. The Shrike paused, tilting his horned head. "I have pilot experience." Pilot! The word was a growl. Why do you think a female Varian would be taken to work the mines? The Shrike jerked its head in agreement. What craft? I cast back to my childhood, to the freighters launching and docking from my homeworld. N12S. The massive Shrike seized my arm and pushed me easily into another line, a line far smaller than the others. Implant her. My co-pilot was called Kel. He saved my life that first time in the 09 or Mule. I think he saw how lost I was, how much pain I was in from the nervo thread woven into the base of my skull to interface the ship's computers with my manual movements. Felt like fire across my fingertips until I healed. Kel was a good teacher, and a quick one. He felt some kinship with another Vari, I think. It was also in his interest that I learn, because his punishment would be just as severe as my own if we failed to complete our directives. He'd been here since the start, long since beaten down into nothing but a mule pilot. No family, no homeworld, no goals, no likes, no dislikes, no dreams. It terrified me. I didn't have a homeworld either, but the desire to survive is hardwired, and he didn't have it. So I piloted Ore Mules, Nervothread as Shriek Tech. Instead of sitting behind the flight controls of whatever craft you want to fly, you are the flight controls. This tech wasn't widespread across the galaxies. Most species can't survive the implant procedures. I barely did, and I have lingering side effects to this day. Even fewer species have the unique characteristics that allow their brains to talk to the computers. The military version of Shrike Neuro Network interface plugs gunners and pilots directly into the ship, made the Shrike Navy a predominant force in any engagement against species that couldn't do the same, hindered by flesh or silicone. Thoughts are faster than actions. Feel like? Ore mules are dumb oafish craft. Getting plugged into one of them feels like slogging through a bog. Thoughts dragged down by sluggish thrusters and cumbersome acceleration. Slave to an 09 is mind-numbing. It's a prison that's built around your thoughts, not your body. I could feel myself becoming like Kel, content to be a slave, just a biological navigation computer. Some tried escape. Another couple of pilots tried ramming their fully loaded mule into the shuttle depot. One of the pilots survived, and the Shrike staked him out over the portal to a shaft we called Villa Vale. They worked on him for 6 shifts. It was impossible to track time in the perpetual twilight of that distant star. No days or night on the tidal-locked surface. Only the slight variations in the timing of the ore shipments depending on the hardness of the rock and durability of the drill heads plugged into the ship computers, controlling thrust by hand signals. Sleep just as brain-dead as my wakefulness. Still better than those souls down in the pits. I think it was 3 rotations in my homeworld's time when I noticed the change. I can't describe what it was exactly. Maybe uncertainty? Like a stutter step when the expected starting bang of a race delays just a fraction too long. Overseers muttering together at their stations. Harsher punishments for every infraction. The products of the mine collecting in depots and warehouses instead of being transported to wherever they were supposed to go. The slightest of whispers that everything was not under control. Everyone began to notice it. No one knew why. A mass escape attempt was made. Creatures fearing the mine's depletion and its assets' liquidation. 17 were taken alive. 17 died unable to continue their screaming at the end. The change pricked the stupor of my nervothread-deadened mind. It made me wake up, just enough to notice that nothing was being shipped out. Whoever was running this mine wasn't there anymore. The Shriek were isolated, alone, stranded. Not like they could petition the core for answers. The shuttles that left didn't return from the void. Comms went unanswered. The ever-dwindling number of Shrike grew ever harsher. I hadn't thought our condition could get worse. Then a Shriek cruiser appeared out of the void, decelerating hard from its sublight journey. That's when I saw my first jump. I mean a jump. Everyone's seen a ship pass through a relay station. Most can't explain the exact physics to you, but jump points are an understood fact, as are the relay stations that shepherd ships through the light years to safety on the other side. This ship I watched, it jumped. No jump points on either side of an FTL lane. It jumped to our remote location on the edge of the black, into a patch of void where it should not have been possible for a ship to materialize. Seems like there should be another term, something new. No, I believe the old way should be called something else. This is what our ancestors first imagined when they looked up at the stars and yearned to travel to them. The ship was primitive, inelegant. No streamlined wings or prismatic synthoglass bridge. Barbaric, almost. I'd never seen warships before, just lumbering freighters and ethereal pleasure yachts. This looked like the Shriek, a breed of ship constructed for war. It was a Terran dreadnought, what they call a destroyer. A warship I had just watched accelerate a kinetic slug through a Shriek cruiser, halfway through its docking procedures. The fuel cell's detonation took out the hangar bay and most of the barracks next to it. Venting atmo fed the fire in barbed gouts, which spread through the docks and guardhouses. A deliberate shot to inflict maximum damage before the flight controllers had noticed the sensor data reporting discrepancies. The destroyer's drive engines seethed with a crimson glow, and the warship accelerated toward what remained of the docks. A dropship launched from the destroyer's belly. Kel was frozen as we watched. Our mule drifted along its last trajectory. As the flashes of the distant explosions faded into the dull orange of sustained fire, I noticed movement on my periphery. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "We need to dock while we still can." Kel looked at me with blank eyes, a wave of his hand adjusting the mule's course with controlled bursts of the maneuvering thrusters. "That's not our directive." I felt something flare through my apathy, the desire to survive, hardwired into me. Moments before I had thought the Shrike cruiser the most dangerous ship in my sector of void. Now I watched its crippled hull drifting from the ruined docks toward the nearest gravity well, spinning on an irregular axis. It broke apart on the fault line from the slug's impact, centrifugal force slinging the rear of the craft toward the hangar's support structures, where it collided in a storm of flame as the engines ruptured. The nose and midship fell toward the moon's surface, venting atmo, increasing the rate of spin. It was midway between dock and surface when another flash lit the void, burning an afterimage into my retinas. The HE round bored into the ship, detonating internally to scatter fragments of cruiser into a smog of slagged alloy and melted synthoglass. Kel jolted hard at the explosion, his flat stare focused on the destroyer. I fumbled with the harness holding me into the pilot's chair, unlocked one clasp, missed the second. Click. I lunged forward and seized the mass of fiber optics at the base of his skull. I tore them away. Kel screamed as his connection with the ship was severed. Nobody thinks twice about removing portable drive safety, but nervothread detach is excruciating without the right separation procedures. He hadn't been detached in void knows how long. I knew he'd be left convulsing on the floor, shuddering with muscle spasms for some time. A gesture brought up the mule's control schemes, projected not in front of my eyes, but into my brain. The fully loaded hauler accelerated sluggishly. A thruster correction sent me on course for auxiliary docks a few kilometers distant. I paused a moment, my hand frozen in the air in front of me. Then, with a savage jab, I jettisoned the oar. I cast my gaze around the surrounding void. The destroyer yawed sideways, using its drive engines to decelerate into a dead stop, only a few hundred meters from the surface, looming over the flaming structures. Most of the other ore mules had scattered like ants, but one continued toward the remains of the docks on nothing but momentum. One of the mass drivers pitched down, servos tracking the trajectory. A pause as the mule made it 1,000 meters farther. Then another flash. The screen in my mule lost a white dot. I mimed for my mule to take a wider loop toward my destination. I was already under maximum acceleration, but I flicked my fingers at the virtual throttle anyway. I seemed a long while before I lost my sightline as I descended toward the surface. I skipped a few of the safeties during my docking, spared a glance for Kel during the detach. He lay on the floor, eyes rolled back in his head. The portal slid open. The station I entered was a ruin, ransacked by the assault. The emergency klaxons blared in rhythm with the emergency lights, beating a staccato tempo against my senses. I stumbled against a wall, unused to even walking. I heard pounding footsteps approaching down the passage and struggled to control my physical form. Wasn't able to before 6 slaves rushed past me, not sparing a look. I staggered down the passage, the light and sound pounding into my skull, toward the caustic scent of burning plastic. I had a plan of sorts. One deck below were the shuttle bays. A shuttle could make the trip through the void, away from this moon, away from slavery, away from that ship. A bang echoed down the passage, far away and faint. Distant, emphatic detonations, like the cadence of an energy rifle but far louder. The blast doors had been forced open by some enormous strength. airtight alloy bent inward from some blow akin to a battering ram. I climbed through the hole, slicing my back and side on the jagged edges.